Right, Dan, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We've had the opportunity to connect before, so I was able to get a pretty good idea of a lot of the work you've done and what your field of expertise and interest is. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to understanding how you've been able to connect a lot of the teachings of the Buddha and find that framework between psychology and philosophy. But before we jump into our conversation, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, what's brought you here, and who you are.
Okay, thank you for having me. First of all, I'm glad for the opportunity to talk with you again. My name is Dan Chappell. I'm a psychologist. I'm now retired. I've over 30 years of experience in as a clinical psychologist, and I'm also the author of 7 books in the area where psychology and philosophy meet. And these books are all available on Amazon.com and they can be reviewed a little bit. I have some descriptions of each of the books on the website meditativeselfcare.com. And if people go there, they can get a bit of a description and some excerpts. And that website is also a way to contact me if anyone would like to do among your listeners.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess the first thing that comes to my mind as you were speaking there is, where do psychology and philosophy meet?
Where
Like
do
for
they
me,
meet?
that's,
Well,
yeah.
okay, that's a fair question. They meet, I suppose, where we want them to meet, where we make
Mhm.
the connections. And I have made the connections between psychology, modern Western psychotherapy, psychology, and on the one hand, the German philosopher Nietzsche, and on the other hand, the Buddhism. And I've also, with some extensions into ancient Chinese philosophy, Confucius and the Taoists and Zhuangzi. And so that's how I have made them meet.
Mhm.
Not entirely accidental. It was a discovery that sort of evolved by itself. I should say, I first got into psychology when I was 13 years old, when we all addressed the big questions of life. At age 13, I came across a book by a book on psychoanalysis. I tried to read that, obviously not very successfully. I didn't understand much of it then, but I kept reading. And so eventually I got into psychology, phenomenological psychology,
Mhm.
and then I got into my first book was on Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return and Freud's psychoanalysis of the repetition compulsion. So that's where my first venture was into seriously linking those two. Over time, that evolved into becoming interested in the parallels between Nietzsche and, of all people, the Buddha. These are not people that we readily think of going together very well. But I studied that and I explored it, and I became really impressed by very significant and generally not very well known connections and similarities between Nietzschean thought and Buddhism. And
Mhm.
eventually wrote a book about that, Nietzsche and the Buddha. And then I got more serious about my practice of Buddhist meditation, and so that's how I ended up writing about what I call meditative self care, which is a bit of a combination of philosophy, psychology, and meditation. I have continued in that direction, continue to practice Buddhist meditation and to teach meditative self care. And eventually that sort of broadened also. And my last book was on a minimalist ethic for everyday life. And that sort of continued with the linkage between psychology and meditation, but broadened it philosophically to include people like Socrates, Confucius, the Taoists, and major ideas from the Judeo Christian tradition, karma theory, and some other things. So it has broadened the connection by deepening the philosophical implications of the connection. because I believe that modern psychology needs to be pushed a little bit further than it currently is. We have now, I think, psychology these days does very good work in the area of, among other things, many other things, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
Psychology says, don't believe everything you think. Some of your thoughts are just not right, but yet you suffer from believing them. For example, if you believe that you're inadequate or not worth being appreciated or whatever, if you're going to believe that, you're going to suffer all the things that come with it, which is
Mhm.
depressed self esteem, depressed feelings, and so on. And so, cognitive behavioral therapy does a very good job at addressing some of those unhappy making, what I call unhappy making ideas and beliefs that we labor under. And the idea in modern psychology is if you free yourself from those ideas, you will also free yourself from the unhappiness that comes with those ideas,
Mhm.
which is a major step forward, I think, in psychology. But then Buddhism goes like a whole giant step further. If cognitive therapy says, don't believe everything you think, Buddhism goes further and says, don't believe anything you think,
Mhm.
because all the thoughts we have are just that. They are thoughts, and they make us see the world in a certain way, which is
Mhm.
comes in handy for all practical purposes. That sort of works very well. But there's a whole raft of erroneous philosophic ideas that come on board with that. And Buddhism is more radical than cognitive therapy in the sense that it questions all our thoughts and beliefs, and so addresses things at that radical level. The result is that whereas modern Western psychology addresses psychology at the level of the individual person and the experiences of the individual person and the notion that there is such a thing as an individual person.
Mhm.
And Buddhism, on the other hand, goes further and says even the very belief that there is such a thing as a fixed individual person is an erroneous idea, and is the very idea that makes us continue to produce beliefs about ourselves. And as long as we produce beliefs about ourselves, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, really makes no essential difference. The essential part is that we continue to produce these ideas and then cling to them. And the
Mhm.
objective is to not only stop or and let go of ideas that are counterproductive and unhelpful and unhappy making, but also begin to let go of the very practice and the habit of believing thoughts about ourselves that pop into our minds. So hence the idea, don't believe anything you think.
No, and I appreciate that. And I do want to get into the whole notion of how we can also further improve modern psychology. And I know you've touched on it in some ways. So I do want to come back to that. But I am curious of all the philosophers that have come throughout time, what was it about Nietzsche that really attracted you to his work?
The Nietzsche begins with a challenge. He presents us with a
Hmm.
big challenge. He asks you and me, he asks everyone, the reader, he says, how would you feel and what would you think if you had to, if somebody told you you have to live your life over and over again, exactly as it has been, endlessly, with nothing new in it, no changes in it?
Hmm.
How would you feel about that and what would you think about it? And when I came across that thought in Nietzsche, when I was beginning to study Nietzsche, I
Hmm.
recognized this challenge for what it is, which is a major challenge. In it asks you, how reconciled are you with your life? How content are you with your life? And if not, Nietzsche says, what would you have to do? How would you have to
Hmm.
change to become more reconciled and at peace with your life? And so that was the bone that I started chewing on and have been chewing on forever. I started my serious study of Nietzsche in 1980, and all seven of my books are essentially elaborations of that study. They are variations of meditations on that study of that idea. And so by now I have landed in both the theory and the practice of meditative self care. And I
Hmm.
think that is, I can now say, okay, I've met the challenge,
Hmm.
Nietzsche's challenge, which is not a small accomplishment. If you're, Nietzsche also recognizes, he says, if you're If you're profoundly, deeply happy, you're going to say, this is a wonderful idea. But for many of us, this is an idea that is not going to make us particularly happy. All the people who believe in an afterlife where they will hopefully meet with better conditions than in the current life,
Mm-hmm.
all those people are being challenged here
Mm-hmm.
because, like the Buddha, also, and this is one of the strongest similarities, Nietzsche challenges us to live happily in this life without there being any import of metaphysical ideas about an afterlife or a better life elsewhere and so on. And
Mm-hmm.
that is also how the Buddha started. The
Mm-hmm.
Buddha, one of the things that makes him radical is that he comes out of a tradition of Hinduism with many gods, endlessly many gods, and he doesn't have much to say about them. He doesn't have anything against them, or he doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
anything for or against them, but he says we have to live in this world, in this life, on this earth. And so his teaching is about that. And in that respect, it is also, again, much like Nietzsche's teaching. It's
Yeah,
about,
and
go ahead.
absolutely. And the challenge you're speaking about is very prominent in the Hindu religion too. In the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about karma and how
Yeah,
if you don't reconcile yourself, you're going to come back. And they refer to it as reincarnation, but the
yeah.
idea is you come back and you have to live this existence again until you can figure it out. Now,
I
I know you
think of it
talked
as
about,
second chances. Like
yeah,
your reincarnation is a second chance. It's a comforting thought in that respect.
I don't know. To me, that would be very uncomfortable to know I have to come back and do it again if I didn't get it right the first time.
Right.
But you referred to the metaphysical aspect of it and to the point that, if you can find contentment in this life, then yes, maybe let's not focus on the metaphysical aspect. But you also referred to the Judeo Christian, and I would say all Abrahamic faiths talk about this idea of an afterlife. So, how do you then bridge that in? Because I know that is something you also delve into in your work. How do you make that connection between the physical and the metaphysical?
I don't deal with the metaphysical like Nietzsche and the Buddha. I
Mhm,
say I can't comment on this on it one way or another.
mhm.
I don't know about what lies beyond what we can know with our senses, and neither does anyone else.
Yeah.
I stop short of that. So, like the Buddha and Nietzsche, I'm not going to fight with metaphysics, but I'm just not going to deal with it because I can't. I
Mhm,
don't know anything about it, and as I said, neither does anybody else. And the best we can do is work with our own knowledge about reality
mhm,
that knowledge comes from our direct experiences,
mm,
from the way we live. And so it's that requires a turning inward to see how exactly does my mind work and
mm,
how does my mind make me live in this world. And then you begin to learn that it is the ideas from your mind that you decide to believe in that create your experiences. And then you begin to come upon the question, well, is that really true, that belief? I don't know. And
mhm.
then you can say, in that case, I'm just going to let go of that. And you
Right.
work strictly with your experience, which is not a statement meant to be atheistic in any sort of simplistic sense of God does not exist. I
Mhm.
think that is very simplistic, overly simplistic atheism.
Yeah.
But it is simply dealing with our experiences, all we have.
Right.
As the philosopher Schopenhauer said that very succinctly, he said, the world is my interpretation. Die
Mhm,
Welt ist meine Vorstellung. And that's all we have is
mhm,
awareness. I see you, you see me. I don't know who you really are. I don't know if you really are. I don't know if you have a soul or anything like that. I see your appearance. I am aware of you. I'm
mhm,
aware of our interaction and how that goes. And that's
mhm,
all we have to work with. But
mhm.
that's enough to
Yeah.
work with.
No, and I appreciate that. But there was an aspect of the state that Buddha referred to as nirvana. Like what I've interpreted that is potentially metaphysical, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts around it. What is the state of
Yeah,
nirvana that Buddha?
I don't quite see it as a metaphysical statement.
Mhm,
It's more a psychological statement. It's a
mm,
statement about that mental state wherein you no longer chase after every thought that runs through your mind. And instead, you see that who you really are is not the things that you believe about yourself,
Hmm.
but the awareness of everything that appears in your experience. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I wonder though, because in some other traditions, there's this whole idea of transcendence, right? Where you become, you rise or transcend past the duality that we experience in this world.
Yeah.
And then you experience this unity, which I come to interpret as it's your true connection to God. But again, I don't know what your thoughts are around that, but
No,
that's
that
my, yeah.
yeah, I have nothing against God and the idea of
Yeah.
God, but I have something against very firm, fixed beliefs about what God is, what He thinks, how He operates.
Hmm.
We don't know.
Yeah.
The ultimate reality, Buddhism is transcendent, and the concept of nirvana is transcendent insofar as it transcends the preoccupation with the personal individual self. You land in a different way of perceiving the world. You end up in a state of consciousness or a mental state wherein the world still remains the same as before, but you don't believe necessarily everything that
Hmm.
appears in your awareness. You don't chase after everything. You watch it. An analogy that I sometimes make is you watch the world and all your own experiences as in the way that a grandparent watches a
Hmm.
grandchild. It is with they watch the child with love, with admiration, but they don't need anything from the child, nor do they struggle as a parent does with a child.
Hmm.
There is a sort of a loving, compassionate, deeply admiring viewing of the child, of the grandchildren, and without having expectations or without needing to manipulate behavior or anything like that.
Hmm.
It's just this all-encompassing and completely affirmative loving of a grandchild, and that's an everyday version of it.
Hmm.
That also is transcended. It transcends the worries of the parent who must
Hmm.
actually teach the child behaviors and this and that. And the grandparent is freed from that. That's the
Hmm.
great luxury of being a grandparent.
Hmm.
And it's a completely different form of affection. Um, and that, I think, is a sort of a world affirming form of affection on a very small scale. But just because the scale is small doesn't mean that the process is small or the impact or the import is small. Not at all. And that's where my work goes. I want to, when I go to philosophy and psychology, I want to show that things that happen in our everyday life and what we call the psychology of everyday life has tremendously deep and broad philosophic implications.
Hmm.
Another form, but it's more of a biblical nature, is the figure of Job. Job is plagued by all kinds of terrible things that he must experience. He has no idea why. He says, I haven't
Hmm.
done anything wrong and whatever. And he gets furious with God and gets almost in an argument with God and so on. And of course, he doesn't win that argument, but he doesn't
Hmm.
lose it either.
Right.
There comes a point where he is shown, supposedly God shows him this incredible panoramic view of creation and of the world and of all the animals and the plants and the natural phenomena. And when Job sees these things again, which surround him on an everyday basis, he is all of a sudden silenced and he's no longer struggling with the
Hmm.
world and with all the pain and suffering that comes in it.
Right.
And then when that happens, he is silenced, and all of a sudden his unhappiness is gone,
Hmm.
and he's relieved. And then he goes on to live a number of years, and as the book of Job says, and he died content.
Mm.
There's only like a handful of people of whom it is said in the Hebrew Bible that they died content. It is such a difficult thing to achieve,
Right.
but he achieves that. And knowing full well that he may again in the future maybe suffer, pain and discomfort and what have you, but he has come to a form of peace, what Nietzsche calls amor fati, the love of all that has
Right.
been, all that is, and all that will be. It
Hmm.
is the grandparent who, it's an unconditional love, no matter what the antics are that
Hmm.
come down the pike. So
Yeah. And
It's
in that,
transcendent.
absolutely, and in that example, what I'm hearing from you in the grandparent example is essentially what the Buddha preaches to is detachment. So you're not attached to any one outcome. What I appreciate in the story of Job also is, despite all the chaos and the adversity and the struggles he experiences, he still doesn't let go of his faith and his conviction.
Yeah.
And I think that's what life is, right? There's going to be a lot of things that come your way, but if you let go of your faith, then it's just going to get worse. But to your
Then
point,
you're in trouble. Then you're in
yeah,
trouble. Yeah.
yeah,
That is, the Buddha never gave up. He sat down
right,
under the Bodhi tree and he said, I'm not leaving here until, my problems are solved. And sure
mhm,
enough, bang, he sat through the night and he became enlightened. And it's also what Nietzsche talks about is both of these people, they are philosophers who see that everyday life is really about suffering before anything else.
yeah,
Traditional Western philosophy seeks truth, the Greeks in particular, and then all Western philosophy after it and all Western theologically inspired philosophy after it seeks truth. And these two philosophers, Nietzsche and the Buddha, they say that's not the biggest thing, really. The biggest thing is that
mhm,
life is difficult and that we
yeah,
have to find a way to reconcile with it, to make peace with it.
mhm,
Um, and that's what happens in Job. And that is what transcends the usual complaints about, oh, poor me, I'm having a
yeah.
tough life.
Yeah, I do want to tie together all the threads we have here, because a lot of this will also come to the modern psychology piece. But before we get there, I also want to understand another side, because you did mention other ancient Eastern philosophies, the Confucianism, the Taoism. In Taoism, what I've come to appreciate, again, they refer it to as the way, but it's very vague in the sense that they don't really define what the way is. But to me, it's, again, we're talking about physical and metaphysical. But for me, the way seems like there's a physical way, but there's also a metaphysical way that you can follow. And you see this in the way they explain it, at least based on my interpretation, is in everything in life, everything is following the way, right? And it's only when we resist the way, the natural flow of life, is when we experience a lot of suffering.
It's when we resist the way things are. It's a simple, the way is simply the way things are, the way
Yeah.
things happen, and the way things go. And it's the impossible is not possible. You cannot make something that happens not happen. You have to deal with it. Things are. Again, in a very pedestrian kind of way. It's
Yeah.
not, and as I mentioned before, I don't deal with metaphysics. That doesn't mean that I reject what people who are dealing in metaphysics say. But
Mm.
I like to bring it back to more down to earth kind of examples of it or variations of it. The way is there's always we can never about anything say how it really is or what it really is. There is always something that remains unsaid, unspoken. The tetragrammaton, Yahweh,
Yes.
expresses that. It says it's an unpronounceable, an unspeakable name. It's the name of God, but it's unspeakable for two
Mhm.
reasons. First of all, it's made of four sounds that are not a sound, really. And secondly, you can't say the name of God or the name of ultimate reality um, because there's always more than any bit. Um,
Right.
and so, in that sense, it is again transcendent. It transcends not in the sense that we end up in a different non substantial world or something, but simply it transcends over everything that we can possibly say. So
Hmm.
there's always more than we can say. And again, I use a very pedestrian example when a couple
Hmm.
is fighting and one says to the other, you just don't understand. Or when a patient in psychotherapy says, you just don't understand, they're absolutely right. There's always things about the other person that we do not understand. And if a psychologist thinks that he or she does understand, both patient and therapist are in trouble. And so it's a pedestrian variation on the theme of Yahweh. You
Hmm.
can't pronounce it. And so what you have to do is be silent. What
Hmm.
Job does.
Right.
And what a good couple will do is just not talk back and not try to rationalize and understand and whatever you say. I just don't
Mhm.
understand. You're right. I don't understand. Fight with it, or that I'm going to try to change it and turn it into something that I think I do understand. No, we
Mhm.
accept the not understanding part. That's
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And we've talked about transcending a few times, but where does space and time fit into this from your
faith in
perspective?
what?
Space and time.
Space and time?
Yeah.
Mm.
When we talk about transcending, where does space and time fit into all of this?
Space, as in the space around
Yeah.
us?
Yeah.
Good question. Interesting question. You got me there. I don't know about space. I have some things to say about space
Yeah.
and also time. Time is a funny thing again. It's one of those time. Where does time exist? It exists in our minds, it
Right.
exists in awareness. Where does the past exist? It's an idea. And
Mm.
the future, the same thing. The only thing we have is the present. That's my approach to that. Space, I don't know about space. It is boundless, it is limitless, it is ever present, like awareness itself. I use when the Buddhists they talk about Rigpa, awareness
Hmm.
itself, which is not awareness of this or awareness of that, but just
Yeah.
simply the capacity of being aware, and that is Rigpa, and that is you can't. It's not a thing, so you can't put it on the laboratory table and examine it. You can't point to it. It is everything and nothing. Everything takes place within space, but space itself cannot be contained or cannot be pointed at. Awareness itself, Rigpa, is just like that. It is boundless, it is vast, and it is ever present, and it is non-reactive. Just like space contains every all the things that are in it, and awareness itself does the same thing. It contains every one of your experiences that are in awareness. But the
Right.
awareness itself is somewhat different. It's not totally separate, because then there is no such thing as awareness itself. Awareness is always awareness of something, just like a mirror. A mirror is always reflects something. A mirror can reflect anything and everything in the whole world. Affected by what it reflects, it doesn't become dirty when it reflects dirt. It doesn't become discolored when it reflects color. It can reflect everything, but it always needs something. It cannot just not reflect something. You can't have a
Hmm.
mirror that doesn't reflect. With awareness, also, we are, you and I, we are awareness before we are who we think we are. So we're aware of, and then what are we aware of? Our personality traits, our bodies, our history, and all that. But it only exists in awareness, just like all things exist in space. Awareness, Rigpa, is like that. So
Yeah.
that's as far as me and space goes, and me and time. That is just present. You
Right.
can't. Where is the past? It's in your awareness too.
And I think to your point, and especially with respect to meditation, there is an idea of where you lose your concept of time and space.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I think it's interesting. And that's where my question was really coming from, too, is where does that concept of time and space go, especially when we're in that meditative state, right? So I think to your point, it all comes down to awareness ultimately.
Exactly, exactly. There comes a point and you can't make this happen. It's something that if your meditation goes well, eventually you'll start having glimpses of that, or at least an understanding of what it would be like if you had glimpses of it. And
Mhm.
eventually you may have glimpses, and then maybe over time the glimpses may become more frequent or more easily accessible or whatever. But lost my train of thought here for a second. What was your question again? That will connect with
No,
this.
I was just commenting on the whole awareness piece and our ability
Yeah.
to transcend time and space, especially in the meditative state, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And how do you reconcile awareness and consciousness? Because there's an aspect there, in today's world, we talk about consciousness quite a bit, but I don't think people fully appreciate it. And to me, I think my understanding is, and everything we've talked about specifically with the teachings of the Buddha, as you're able to detach more and more from the worldly things
Yeah.
and some of that suffering we experience, our consciousness also rises, right? And I don't know if that's too simplistic, but that's been my understanding.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that brings me back to the previous point, and I remember what I was going to say now. There comes a time, a moment in meditation when things go well and you've evolved in your meditation skills and your understanding of these things, when it feels like when you're no longer identified with your body.
Mm.
You almost don't know where your body is. Of course, intellectually, you know where it is, but you are not identified with it. You are like an almost, I don't want to say disembodied awareness because that sounds a little bit too trippy. There's nothing trippy about it. It's just, it's your first glimpse and your first taste of awareness itself. It's that
Hmm.
sense of that you don't no longer feel your body. And everything goes on around you and you're aware of all kinds of thoughts and whatever, but they're not like my personal thoughts or my personal feelings. They're just, it's like on a screen, things pass by. So, in that sense, then you become detached from, not again in the negative sense of becoming isolated
Right.
or whatever, but you stop being attached to and identified with all the usual content of your mind.
Hmm. There's another thing that you mentioned earlier when it comes to atheism and this. You said to say, and sorry, I'm paraphrasing here, but to say there's no God is too simplistic. What do you mean by that? And I'm curious to expand on it a little bit further because I know Nietzsche also made this proposition that God is dead. And I know he didn't mean the same thing, but
Right.
what are your thoughts around like the simplistic view of atheism? And then what did Nietzsche mean?
Yeah,
Because I have some thoughts. Yeah.
What Nietzsche meant, he didn't mean like the old God all of a sudden died.
Mhm.
He meant that the beliefs associated with that God and with the religion of that God, those beliefs have become like feet of clay that are, and so it is more a philosophic statement. It's not a theological statement. It
Yeah.
is basic beliefs are crumbling, he saw, and we see that today in today's world that basic beliefs crumble. We actually in this in the United States, a lot of people don't even believe in the Constitution anymore either. He's talk about a feet of clay crumbling. So that's what Nietzsche meant. And so he also would have, he didn't mean like God is dead, like God does not exist. That's not at all
Hmm.
what he meant. When you say God exists or does not exist, you treat God in an oversimplified fashion as if it were a thing or a being or
Hmm.
something you can circumscribe with a definition and so on. And that's, of course, you miss the boat entirely because the very idea of what we call divine or what should be called divine is that it is unspeakable. It doesn't mean it's nothing, it doesn't mean it's crazy or an illusion. It's just there's more to this world that we can say or than we can say, and that's what he meant. And that's also what I mean is instead of saying God does not exist and I'll prove it to you, that is such naive. I find that there's a whole cottage industry now of these
Yep.
religion haters like Richard Dawkins and
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
his companions. And I think they're like, these are the kind of things we all said when we were 14 years old. You grow beyond that and you say, well, maybe things are a bit more complicated or more subtle and whatever. And
Yeah.
because I think they have a very poor idea of what religion is.
Hmm.
Religion
Yeah.
is not just a litany of beliefs that some people who don't know any better I
Hmm.
mean, there are certain beliefs and there are certain forms of taking things too literally for sure. But that's not what religion is. It's
Hmm.
religion is an attempt to say what it is to be human. Religion is about humans. It's not about otherworldly alien creatures. That's why you have people like Einstein. Einstein, sober mind if ever there was one. He
Hmm.
says, "I'm a religious non-believer."
Right.
That seems like a contradiction, but no,
Yeah.
he was saying that there are certain experiences that he would call religious, but he wouldn't tackle them with prefabricated beliefs.
Mm.
Somebody else does something similar. Jung also,
Yeah.
very interestingly, he says religion is a defense against religious experience. Now, that's a whopper of a statement, I think. Religion is a defense against religious experience. because we're all capable of religious experiences.
Yeah.
But when we slap on the label of belief, we're lost and we
Hmm.
lose our religious experience as well.
Yeah. Right.
And that's the big difference. That's where our current world has got a lot of work to do, I think, because
Yeah.
a lot of the beliefs have been crumbling.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean the underlying experience of awe, essentially, the awe of existence, that is a fundamental experience that everyone is capable of, and that you
Hmm.
again re experience in meditation if you're lucky and if things work out
Right.
and so on. If you're
Yeah.
open minded and if you have an open heart.
Absolutely. And I think to your point and that Jung comment around religious experience and religion, and when you tried, and I think you touched on it earlier too, with respect to trying to fit God into one word and trying to put religious experiences under religion, that's where you become, where you put yourself in a bit of a bind because to your point also, that's where you get those, you get so stuck in dogma, and I think that's what
Right.
Nietzsche was referring to. And to your point, that's what we're seeing in the world today, that people are so attached to the beliefs that they're missing out on the experience. And they're
Exactly.
trying to define it in words that a lot of these experiences cannot be put into words.
Exactly. They become silence becomes the language.
Yeah.
As somebody said, I forget who it is. Silence is the language of God. The rest is just commentary. It sounds
Yeah.
like a Sufi philosopher or something.
It sounds like Sufism for sure. Now, talking about Carl Jung, and obviously you spent a lot of time studying all of this. He and Freud separated for various reasons. But what do you think was the main underlying reason where Freud's understanding of the mind, Carl Jung, they decided to go different ways? I think Carl Jung started to see a lot of aspects of the soul as well in our, a lot of the times it's the soul in a lot of the conflicts we have. And I think this is the issue we see with modern psychology too. But I want to get your thoughts as well.
The fundamental difference between Freud and Jung, and there are a number of differences that
Yeah.
could be identified, but I think the fundamental difference is the difference between the individual unconscious, which is Freud's
Yeah.
wheelhouse, and Jung's collective unconscious.
Mm.
Freud had this notion of that everything is determined by your history, the history of your personal individual unconscious. That is the alpha and omega of that is
Mm-hmm.
the test, the what do they call it? There's a word for it. The litmus test, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
individual consciousness. Whereas Jung discovered or appreciated and expanded on the notion of the collective unconscious, and that I think is his genius, where that collective unconscious is all of a sudden it's universal. It's far more universal. It's not strictly historical. It's not strictly personal, but it is
Mm-hmm.
collective, and it goes beyond again anything that we can say about it. Freud thought that he could say the last word about the individual unconscious. If you
Mm-hmm.
kept him going long enough, then he would name everything in your basement of your personal unconscious, so to speak.
Yeah.
He would inventory it all. Jung would not even conceive that such a thing would be possible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there is an endlessness in Jung that has to be appreciated, I think, a boundless of notions, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
collective unconscious.
Yeah. No, and I agree. And we've talked about modern psychology. So then where, and I know you touched on it earlier, and it's referred to as a behavioral science, and that's something you and I had chatted about previously. But
Yeah,
you often see, and I know you talked about CBT and the idea of saying you are not your thoughts, really question your thoughts. And then they almost treat, they started talking about, and I learned this in school too when I was going to for like the master's program in psychology, this idea of treating mindfulness separately, right? And then you teach people these skills of practicing mindfulness so that it helps them. But everything you've shared, especially with Buddhism, the two go together. You don't need to treat them separately as modern psychology does.
but in terms of mindfulness, you mean?
Yeah.
Mindfulness, the way it's practiced in the West, the way it's popularized, I think, again, runs the risk of becoming limiting, self limiting, because it focuses on content, mind
Mm-hmm.
content. And which is all very important. And I won't argue with the importance of it all, but it is not enough. It doesn't reach that boundary where we transcend content and become aware of awareness itself. And that's what's missing in the contemporary fascination with mindfulness. And that's, I think, that would be my criticism of the Western popularization of Buddhism when it thinks that mindfulness is the same as Buddhism. Mindfulness is just one of the 8 steps in the Eightfold Path, the
Hmm.
teaching of the Eightfold Path. And it's a very important one, no question about it. But we're always in the West, we always reduce everything to the psychology of the person with their personal history and their personal quirks and habits and what have you. And all that is indeed material that goes into our experience, but it is not the bottom line, and it is not all of who we are. All of who we are is awareness itself, not the content of awareness. And
Hmm.
that's a difficult thing to get across. That's what I run into most in my writing and teaching, is that people have trouble with that. And I don't blame them, because the whole Western history of philosophy is geared toward focusing on the personal self. And to begin to try to go beyond that is just way too threatening and way too. If you only have minutes a day to meditate and you go to a meditation group once a week, that's not enough to get to that
No.
sort of beyond that boundary. You still think that's when you end up with the word, the tetragrammaton Yahweh was eventually became Yahweh, was made pronounceable in a way
Mm.
that's like cheating. It's in a way, it's like you lose the very thing that it captured. And so the same thing with mindfulness, I believe, and the focus on the personal self. And that's where I think the West has a long ways to go. And that's where my argument in my book on Nietzsche and the Buddha is that Nietzsche may well be the first Western, the Buddha of the West.
Right.
Um, and but that's something that even many Nietzsche readers or Nietzsche scholars are not quite ready to see. Even
Yeah.
serious Nietzsche scholars won't go that way. So I know, I think about 5 people who wrote books, book length studies of that topic. And that's it. And of course, they're not bestsellers either.
Right. Yeah.
You don't go read them on the beach during the summer.
Yeah. It would require a pretty deep exploration. So,
Yeah.
and then we've made reference to the current culture a few times too. And one of the things you had mentioned to me previously was the golden rule and tying that to our current culture. How do you do that? How do you bring that
Yeah,
forward?
the golden rule comes from chapter 9, no, chapter 19, verse 18 of Leviticus. Right smack in the middle of the 5 books of Moses. So
Mhm.
it is quite literally the heart of Judaism, the golden rule, which is love your neighbor as yourself. You know, so it's a great idea,
Yeah.
and Christianity took it over. And I think many Christians seem to, I believe, think that they invented it, that Christianity invented it, but it is older than that. It is part of the Jewish tradition. The problem with that is we can't force ourselves to have loving feelings toward our neighbor. That's a big problem. We may have the best of intentions, but if you can't generate a loving feelings, how can you act lovingly? That seems like really very hard. And we can see it in everyday life. This is supposed to be a Christian nation, as many people claim. Americans are not exactly the most Christian of people. And so the problem with that is that it is too difficult to do. And so I came across Confucius, who says, uh, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you.
Mhm.
That may sound at first always the same thing, just in different words. No, it's a very different thing, because it is, you can't, it's not an attempt to force loving feelings, because we can't do that. But everyone can refrain from acting like a jerk. Even
Mhm.
if you don't have loving feelings, you can still be polite. As they say to children, be polite. And so that's what my last book is all about, is to, I call it a negative ethic, a minimalist negative ethic. It's an ethic that says not what to do, i.e., love your neighbor as yourself, but what not to do. Don't like,
Mhm.
don't act like a jerk. And so I've elaborated that in terms of I go to various places: Socrates, Confucius, the Taoists, some of the Judeo Christian practices, and some other things where we can make, we can create a negative minimalist ethic that
Mm-hmm.
works, that is practically more doable than the grander goal of loving your neighbor as yourself. The net result is the same thing. You won't treat other people poorly, but it is easier, it's more realistic to do, and it leads to a better understanding of
Mm-hmm.
who we are as people, as human beings, what it is like to be a human being. It leads you to the understanding that it's not the personal self that is the measure of all things. And that brings you closer to that boundary where you transcend the notion of personal psychology and you
Mm-hmm.
get into the psychology of awareness itself,
Mm-hmm.
where we are not persons with minds, we are awareness itself, an awareness that believes it has a mind and it is mind. That's what this, my jumping off from the Judeo-Christian golden rule, that was the purpose of that. Because I
Mm-hmm.
age, I think we live in a time of really seriously dangerous nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in American political life. It is frightening, I think, how divided the United States is as a nation. And I think we are now in the same position where Confucius was in his day. He lived in a China that wasn't called China yet, but the
Mm-hmm.
country had been united pretty much, and then it fell apart as a result of personal striving for power and greed and what have you. And so that's when the philosophers came into being in China. They were far more practical philosophers than our Western philosophers ever have been. And so we are, I think, in this. And there's some China scholars who are making the same where Confucius was in his time, uh, with the nation falling apart. And
Everything you're talking about, ancient, like from Confucius' time, 2,500 years ago, and we don't seem to learn from history. So, and you've made reference to the division we see in the Western world, but I would argue we're seeing that everywhere right now. And my view, and I think we've touched on it also, is the attachment we have to the self. And there's so much chaos that we experience within ourselves that we tend to project this outward, and that's where that division comes. So, what do you think needs to happen from a general perspective in order for us to find that commonality that we tend to be lacking? And how does history teach us anything if we were to look at history?
yeah, if I could answer that with a ready-made answer that is going to work for everyone, I would be very successful indeed. And but I think what we need is a fundamental shift in our philosophic beliefs. And we have to reimagine, first of all, on a practical basis. I think in the United States we have to reimagine what it means to be an American. We've spent like the last 9 years or something losing the sense of what it means to be an American and what it means to be America as a nation and as an ally to our allies and so on. And we have to rediscover that. And I think maybe that may be the practical level where that eventually will have to happen. It's not going to happen in one generation or in one presidency or anything like that. But and I think before we make that turn, I think we may have to suffer a great deal more before that.
Mhm,
But I think fundamentally that is what has to happen. I think a book that I'm working on now, the number 8, is about the evolution of consciousness. Nietzsche talks somewhere, and I've mentioned that in my books here and there, the notion of the overhuman. The overhuman in German is the Übermensch, but that has a bad connotations like the Nazi as an Übermensch. That's of
yeah.
course not at all what he meant. The overhuman is simply the human who overcomes, who transcends his erroneous habits of thinking, including as number one the habit of thinking that the personal self is an entity and is a unit of meaningfulness and a unit of being. And that's not at all the case. We are awareness itself, which is much broader, which contains all notions of personality and personhood and whatever. That's a radical change. And how or when that is going to happen, or if it is going to happen, that's beyond my pay grade. But I do think, I fear that if we don't make that turn, if not more people make that turn, we are in big trouble. We are in big trouble because there's no reason to believe that we're automatically going to continue to exist as we have now,
Hmm.
instead of maybe destroying ourselves. I think our destroying ourselves is a real possibility, I think. The eighth book that I'm working on is about that change of consciousness where we think in terms of the overhuman, the human who overcomes his pettiness. It's a notion you find in a number of places. It's a notion you find in Buddhism as well. The bodhisattva is a sort of an overhuman. He overcomes the pettiness of being human. So there are models of it, models for it, not a whole lot of them. Emerson in the United States here writes about the oversoul.
Hmm.
Um, so there are models of it, but it is a model that is difficult to come by. To me, one form or one model is the tradition of keeping the Sabbath, which is keeping the Sabbath is one place, one day of the week, so to speak, where the usual notions don't apply. The usual obligations of needing to do what we always do don't apply. It is the seventh day of the week. It's just also in the tradition of the book of Genesis. The seventh day God rested. That doesn't mean that he was tired from creating the universe, but he simply created the sense of restful witnessing of the universe. That, boy, this is damn good, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's what keeping the Sabbath is all about, is to teach people the practices, the habitual, the rituals that go with it, and that help us create that sense of a Sabbath. People in a practicing Jewish family tradition, they all remember the Sabbath as a special day when mom cooked these special foods and dad told these stories and whatever. It was a special time. Everyone together. There was no unhappiness. That's a way in which I think we can access that model of what it would be like to be an overhuman. An overhuman is a guy who's celebrating the Sabbath every day, so to speak. And so
Yeah.
that's my,
Yeah.
I'll leave.
No, I appreciate that. And ultimately, it comes back to what you said earlier, being in the present moment. And
Absolutely. There's
that's,
nowhere else to be,
yeah.
you know?
And that's what we're lacking. It's that
Yeah.
balance we need. And all the practices are there. We just need to start looking and
Yeah.
following them.
The knowledge, and we have
Yeah.
a bunch of people who are trying to work the practices and the rituals and whatever, but we need far more of them.
I agree. Thank you so much, Dan, for your time. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed this conversation,
Me
and
too,
I,
Furcom. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
yeah, and I hope to talk to you again. I would love to have you on again, but for listeners, I know you mentioned the best way to find your work is meditativeselfcare.com. So I
Yes, that's the
encourage people to
website.
check it out. All your books are there, and stay tuned for the eighth one that you're working on, because that's
Yes.
going to really guide us,
Right.
right?
Okay. I would love to come back and talk with you further, Furcom. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, and we'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. All right. Goodbye now.